And the challenge that we face here was posed many years ago, even before Crutzen named the Anthropocene, by Michel Serres in his book, The Natural Contract. In nature, there are one or more natural equilibria described by mechanistic philosophy, thermodynamics, the physiology of organisms, ecology, or systems theory. In the same way, cultures have invented one or more equilibria of a human or social type, defined, organized, maintained by religion, laws, or politics. We have failed to conceive, construct, and put to work a new global equilibrium between these two. Serres has been arguing for a new arrangement that brings the two etymological descendants of the term oikos into equilibrium, the ecological and the economic, or the social. And this means we haven't been able to think the cosmos as a whole, nature and culture, those two loaded terms, as one thing. This is what I'm aiming at with the concept of cosmograms, objects that contain the universe. This is a term that I first heard in a lecture about the tabernacle in the book of Exodus, which contained the tables of the law, clean and unclean animals, as well as the census of all the members of the society, and it was built of all the technologies that were available at the time. So, of course, religious objects like this one clearly exemplify the notion of a cosmogram, a map or an object that contains everything that is. Also, Buddhist mandalas, the Congo inscription of the higher and lower realms. But one of the advantages of the term is that it doesn't force us to divide religion and science, since after all, the cosmos is all that is. So even in scientific visions, the term attunes us to emblematic imagery, such as the symbolism of Francis Bacon. Some cosmograms, those that are very familiar to us, make a point of separating the natural and the supernatural, as in Darwin's Tree of Descent, produced by natural selection, or the US science popularizer of the 1970s, Carl Sagan, in his TV series Cosmos. This was a cosmos without God. But that division between natural facts and human beliefs and meanings is itself of a cosmological order, just one ontological possibility, that of naturalism, to use the term of Philippe Descola. But even in the West, there have been other possibilities for organizing the whole, as with the analogism between micro and macro, as found in the early modern period, as in Robert Flood's works, not just representing, but showing how to intervene in and alter nature, as well as the correspondences between different realms, the human and the much larger non-human. Obviously, the concept risks being overly general, but compared to disembodied concepts like worldview, cosmology, conceptual scheme, or even culture, there's something very concrete and locatable about the term cosmogram. You can point to them. You can pin them down in a place, a time. You can follow how it was made and what people have done with it. Further, cosmograms don't assume uniform assent or shared belief or bounded interpretations. The wholes that they assemble may be multiple, contested, essentially incomplete, subject to modification over time and through negotiation. I'd like the term to be flexible enough to include the kinds of things that we've been talking about on our islands so far in this conference, small particular objects, cosmic things like the rock and the diskette, or even the ice core samples and golden spikes that geologists use to listen to the age of the Earth. But today, I'd like to focus on larger scale cosmograms, singular objects that are sites for collective action and coordination. My subtitle alludes to J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words, about the performative uses of language, acts that bring about changes of state, such as, I now pronounce you man and wife, the defendant is guilty. So I want to look at cosmograms in use, why and how they get constructed, their different modes of access, their experiential aspects, and the changes they performatively bring about, what we might call cosmo-pragmatics. A good place to start is right here where we are, this house, which holds the cultures of the world, as it's known to Berliners, the pregnant oyster. Now, I apologize to those of you who know the story already. Originally, this building we're in was called the Congress Hall. It was completed in 1957 as a US contribution to the Interbau exhibition, which rebuilt the Hansa Quarter just northwest of here, with designs from Gropius, Niemeyer, Le Corbusier, arch-modern architects, enemies of the ornamental. Set in the replanted Tiergarten after trees had been airlifted in, the design of the building emphasizes the lecture hall that we're in, like a mouth facing outward, as well as the curve of the roof, almost a Mobius strip, merging the inside and the outside. The architect, Hugh Stubbins, saw it as a place in which to, quote, plan for a better world to live in. He insisted on the openness of the forms, yet did so under heavy constraints. He had to please the West German government, Berliners, and of course the US occupying forces. But he also had to be sure that the thing itself met its own structural and material demands, that it stayed upright. An early East German critic said that the ring that formed the roof of the building was overly complex. It put too much pressure on the two pillars that supported it, and it failed, therefore, to unite form and function. Stubbins answered that function, quote, must be subordinated to the goal of beauty. Humans have a fundamental need for symbols. So, at this moment in the past of a new beginning, Stubbins' voice in favor of the symbolic, the aesthetic supplement, integrated into mere utility. This voice, amplified, of course, with Marshall Plan funds and the US military presence, is a fitting emblem for our inquiry here into objects that house the whole world. Unlike modernist functionalism, in the Anthropocene, the purely utilitarian and factual are no longer simply separable from the symbolic, the intentional, and the aesthetic. So my talk today has three parts. First, I'll look at fairly diverse and wide-ranging examples of cosmograms in action to bring out some of the points that allow us to think comparatively about intersections between symbol and fact, between everyday activity and cosmic order, as a stimulus to thought as we're trying to plan and think about ways to represent the new whole that we occupy in the Anthropocene. Then I'll turn to one time and place, early 19th century France, the dawn of industrial society, and some have seen as the birth of the Anthropocene, which is also the age of Romanticism. The cosmograms of this period reveal a less familiar modernity than we may have often thought of, where there are views of technology woven into the non-human milieu to produce a second creation, and in the most interesting cases, a kind of interdependent balance we might think of as curation, very much in lines with the natural contract that Michel Serres urges us to think of. Finally, I'll end with a few thoughts about the cosmograms we might cook up to meet the pressures of the Anthropocene. So my first example comes from medieval India, back in the 8th century. So, reorient in time, reorient in space. After a victory against a rival dynasty, the king Lalitaditya becomes the supreme king of northern India. This grants him dominion over all the people that he'd conquered and all the lands, as well as the obligation as the new king of kings to found a new imperial city and a new temple. To choose the location of this new city, there's no official source to go to. He's also now officially the supreme master of all knowledge and has to choose for himself which body of knowledge is truest for his time. The highest point of India, seen as its center, was Mount Kailash, just north of Nepal. And he chose to shorten the distance to the central support of India by placing his city far to the north, near to his own home base in Kashmir, where two rivers pass. Now, with this new imperial city, the temple he builds just outside its gates becomes Mount Kailash, becomes the new central mountain. He has reoriented the land, recentering it here, much further north. According to scholars of medieval India, this act was not just a representation of his place in the human and cosmic hierarchy. It's a performative, a rewriting of the chain of being, a stretching of the land, placing himself and the physical site above those already there. Further, the temple itself, built according to a text called the Sarvatobhatra, contains in its own walls a chain of being. There's a shrine and a statue of Vishnu in the center, which is the place of juncture between the material and the spiritual realms. This inner sanctum is only accessible for direct observation, or darshan, to the king and Brahmins who serve the god. Devotees, landowners, nobles could give puja at the outer images, and lower castes are forced to remain outside. So there's a metaphysical order that brings with it a social order, all of which are coordinated within this physical structure. This is not a static objective order, whether natural or social, as the British Raj will later try to impose. This chain of being changes with each era, with each dynasty. It's performatively realized through the creation of this cosmogram. This in turn regulates everyday activity, assembling a social world as well as a physical and even a supernatural world and the relations between them. So to jump again, my second case moves forward to the early 16th century, to Seville, in the southwestern edge of Europe. This is another imperial story from the start of Spain's maritime domination and a shift in the center of gravity of the Mediterranean from east to west. The place in question is the Casa de la Contratación, or the House of Trade, founded by Queen Isabella for collecting taxes and duties, approving all voyages, overseas trade, and exploration. Here, navigators have to take an oath to report any new lands or resources they discover and faithfully inscribe them. So God and the king and queen and the material wealth of the kingdom, as well as newly conquered lands and peoples, all are part of this house. Inside it is the Padrón Real, the secret map of New Spain and in fact of the whole globe. All new lands and landmarks and routes must be added to it. But there's a fundamental disagreement about what this world map contains and how to assemble it. A conflict rages between the court cosmographers and the returning pilot major, Sebastian Cabot, over what map to use and thus who would have authority over exploration and discovery. The cosmographers who worked for the court preferred astronomical methods, the view from above, the Apollonian view, while the sailors used portolan charts with trajectories marked by compass directions from various landmarks down in the midst of things. This casa is also where maps drawn up with the aid of native informants will eventually produce what Serge Grzinski calls mestizo knowledge. So again, the Padrón Real is performative. It's instituting a new social order, establishing the conditions for the exploitation of the new world and its inhabitants, defining a physical, legal, religious, intercultural space. Yet it's a site for marking differences among multiple users and agencies where actual agreement is far from obvious. The multiple stakeholders, each with their own styles of thought, preferred techniques, and material interests, show that the creating of cosmograms involves what Isabel Stengers calls a cosmopolitics, a diplomatic, and in some cases, a violent encounter between methods, epistemologies, and in many cases, ontologies. What counts as a being? A cosmogram may appear united, but in fact exists within the tension of such different trajectories. So my third comparative example lets us switch once again, now to the Islamic world. This Mappa Mundi shows the cosmological significance of Mecca and Medina, which are placed at its center, not Rome, not Jerusalem, as in more familiar medieval maps. Although these are recognized on the map, cosmograms frequently have to contend with rival, contemporary, or earlier orderings, must find a place for them. There's often an element of encapsulation, supersession, or even, to speak like a situationist, détournement. In Islam, geography, the body of the earth, serves a powerful orienting function. Coordinating the faithful on the earth from medieval times onward was the astrolabe, a kind of personalized, portable cosmic object, a medieval GPS device, allowing travelers to tell the time for the 5 daily prayers. So they face the same center at the same time in a wave across the earth, following the sun, oriented towards the Holy Lands. Likewise, the Hajj, or the once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca, unites them in time and space. Far from a traditional or archaic practice, the pilgrimage as a mass phenomenon is thoroughly modern. Indeed, we can consider it part of the Great Acceleration after 1950. Only 50,000 made the journey in 1950, and that number rose to 400,000 in 1975 and 2.5 million in 2009. These days, of course, you can arrange your Hajj online, as in this package deal offered from Queens, New York, or for a slightly classier version, you might try this site in Australia, the Sacred Journey of a Lifetime. The cosmo-pragmatic points I want to raise here are drawn out in a terrific book called A Season in Mecca, an account of the Hajj taken by Abdallah Hamoudi, a Moroccan anthropologist working in France and the US. His account shows how cosmograms are often part of highly structured mass organization while still producing an ineluctably embodied individual experience. So he details how there's a fixed quota of spaces allowed for each Muslim country with a specific order for where to begin and end. This entails crowd control problems far beyond a rock concert or the Olympics, with 2 million people enacting the same ritual journey in the same order. Hamoudi is hilarious in describing his discomfort with the endless bus journeys, lousy food, and uncomfortable lodgings. Even more intriguing is his analysis of how the Saudi royal family has fashioned itself as protectors of the holy sites, establishing a heavy security presence, wiring the place for constant pronouncements, supporting a strict Wahhabist interpretation of every step of the journey, enforcing rules of dress and conduct, mowing down holy sites to prohibit idolatry. These guys really get on the narrator's nerves. And nevertheless, even he, a non-believer, finds himself, through the collective experience of the stages of the journey, and even against his own intentions, awakening to some stirring, a palpable sense of commonality and brotherhood, recollections of a faith that he thought he had left behind. So from these examples, we see the performativity of cosmograms, the work they do in establishing an order, but also the different interests and tensions they inscribe. Further, they involve mass communication and its technologies, access, and crowd control, as well as strong possibilities for abuse when acts of totalization verge on the totalitarian. At the same time, the embodied encounter with these cosmic objects unfolds unpredictably, with the possible result of a radical reorientation of one's identity, motivations, and mode of being in the world. So in my second section, I'm focusing on just one period, Paris in the 19th century, the early Anthropocene, with examples from my book, The Romantic Machine. This period is often characterized as one of reductive mechanism, of factuality, as in the myth of Dickens' school teacher grad grind from Hard Times, and an avalanche of numbers assembled by mechanical procedures. Some people see this as the moment of the birth of the modern scientific worldview. Another short term for this way of seeing the world is to call it positivism. But this was also the age of Romanticism, both a despairing recognition of the limits of knowledge, as well as a passionate drive for the realization through art, through science, through poetry, and through politics of the soul or mind in nature. Under the combined influence of industrialization and Romanticism, new visions appeared at this time of human activity assisted by machines that tapped into hidden forces of heat, light, and electricity. A new concept of nature also emerged as something that could be reshaped by human labor with the help of machines. This had a political dimension, as in the utopian fantasies of Charles Fourier, known to readers of Walter Benjamin. But plans other than Fourier's, much more central and influential, not lost in dusty arcades, also, like Fourier, drew upon new science, new machines, and techniques of mass communication to institute a new, vibrant cosmos, an idea of nature whose potentials can be drawn forth by human labor. One example, somewhat close to where we are, is offered by Alexander von Humboldt, one of Berlin's favorite sons who spent half his life in Paris. Even before his book, Cosmos, Humboldt was producing cosmograms like this one from his journey to the Americas, which mapped the connections among pressure, temperature, magnetism, and different plants in different ecological niches at different altitudes, as well as the scientific instruments that made these known. each of which corresponds to one of the vertical columns in the diagram. Showing the particularity and unity across diverse milieus, Humboldt was hugely influential for later earth science and, in fact, the birth of ecology and environmentalism. His science aimed at producing sublime aesthetic effects of unity, a sense of humans' involvement with and responsibility for its landscapes with the help of precision technology. An even stronger case of mechanical romanticism lies in the works of the industrial prophet Saint-Simon, who was an adventurer and a propagandist who was stunned in the late 18th century by the potential scale and impact of coordinated human activity, really right at the dawn of the Anthropocene. He dreamed that the whole of France will one day become a superb English garden. Catholicism, the spiritual power of the Middle Ages, he said, had failed to keep up with advances in knowledge, and in order to reorient society towards industry and away from the feudal and theocratic order of the past, only a new religion would do the job. Only that could unite and motivate humanity on the scale that was now needed, and to reach what he now saw as the collective goal of humanity, the improvement of the poorest and most numerous class. So his followers took up this call in founding the Saint-Simonian religion. They rewrote Genesis, the story of the creation, and in fact a whole new Bible, the new book they called it, reframing cutting-edge sciences of their time. Many of them had attended the École Polytechnique in religious terms, in line with a pantheist metaphysics inspired by Schelling, as well as by the steam engine, where spirit and matter were merged. Their doctrine united God, humans, and nature via symbols, rituals, and other technologies. They also drew new maps. In their Paris, replacing Notre Dame, the cathedral at the center of the city, stood a new cosmogram, the Saint-Simonian Temple. This was a giant woman with shops, cafes, and offices in the folds of her dress, with music and spectacles of all kinds emanating from her and found within her. A voltaic battery with electricity, metal light, and panoramas reuniting the whole world in a single point in all space and time. The building, according to one of the Saint-Simonians who wrote a poem, or in fact a hymn, in praise of this building, would reunite the whole world and all the religions of the past, the ancient temple of the Hebrews, the ruins of Thebes and Palmyra, the Parthenon, Alhambra and St. Peter's, the Kremlin, mosques of the Arabs, pagodas of India and Japan. It was a gigantic moralization of a whole people. An interfaith cathedral, a natural history museum, a shopping mall, and an IMAX theater, all in one. Just like Marx's 1844 manuscripts written in Paris at the exact same time as these ideas were being put to paper, the Saint-Simonians' vision of social reform was grounded in an underlying metabolism, a view of a humanity whose essence was to summarize its own history by transforming and weaving itself into the forces of the earth. Another, even more influential follower of Saint-Simon was Auguste Comte, the founder of both sociology, the history of science, as well as positivism. He invented that term and the term sociology. Comte's philosophy of science began by recognizing the limits of our knowledge, that science can only establish recurrent relations among phenomena, not underlying causes. That would be falling into metaphysics. Positivism was against metaphysics as much as it opposed theology. His hierarchy of the sciences, listed here, was resolutely artificial, he said. We have to abandon the notion of a natural system that holds everything in place. The only unity is imposed by humans on the basis of their physical and intellectual needs. Each science has its own concepts, methods, and temporality. Each became positive, that is, left theology and metaphysics behind at its own moment, and each dealt with specific phenomena, each with their own degrees of activity. For the most recent sciences, biology and sociology, the term milieu, or environment, or surroundings, was central. Life, he claimed, does not exist simply within the limits of the body of an organism, but in its interaction with its nutritive envelope, its conditions of existence. His hierarchy of sciences showed the points at which these conditions could be altered, those which were nearest to us, those which were most modifiable, as well as the limits of that power of modification. Sociology, the most complex and the most recent science to become positive, coordinated this scale of knowledge and these different temporalities to meet the needs of our species. But to organize human society, to make it truly organic, and that's what he meant by organizing, to guide it in a sane, healthy integration with its milieu, humanity itself would have to be remade. In the 1840s, under the influence of a feminist novelist, very influenced by George Sand, Clotilde de Vaux, Comte reinvented his approach, arriving at a merger of cognition and motivation, fact and value, as discussed by Akil and Depeche in the last couple days. This would be a new spiritual power, teaching the sciences as a doctrine, administering a cult of worship, and guiding the temporal power, the new regime, led by industrialists, but guided by the new priests of humanity, the positive philosophers. This meant reclaiming humanity's distant past, taking the straight line of progress and bending it into a recapitulative movement. Fetishism, the belief in active, intelligent powers in non-human nature, was no longer seen as an earlier developmental stage of humanity, but as the eternal basis of social unity. Only devotion to some greater object could lead people out of egotism and developed what he called altruism, another term he invented. To move forward, we had to move back. So he announced in a book called The Subjective Synthesis 3 fictional but necessary objects of worship: the great being of humanity, the great milieu, and the great fetish of the earth, on whose power and generosity we depend. The collective worship of these beings would take place in a temple, which he drew up very detailed plans for, even picking out the color of the curtains. In France, this building was never built. But one was built in 1881 in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, where positivism appealed to rising professional classes as a shortcut out of feudalism, theocracy, and slavery, directly into a technocratic republicanism. Inside this temple, which still stands, the saints of the positive calendar lined the walls, scientists, religious figures, and inventors of political systems who gave the most to humanity. And I want to thank Margarete Voringer and Birgit Schneider for these photos of St. Paul representing Catholicism, Gutenberg representing industry, Bichat representing modern science. Key stages in humanity's progression are also represented: polytheism, monotheism, positivism, and of course, fetishism. At the nave are idols of Comte, the high priest, and humanity itself, Clotilde de Vaux holding a child representing humanity, the great being. This was a memory palace, a time machine to join the past with the future, weaving humans together into their milieu. So this first positivism, also the term we now use for the most reductive, disenchanted assumptions of the modern age, culminated in a cosmogram that worshipped an artificial nature, drenched in affect, perception, and intention. It was not just facts and protocol sentences, as the later neo-positivists would emphasize, but a concrete, emotional, and multi-species ethical structure, training all members of our species, scientists included, to orient their thoughts and actions toward at once the great being of humanity and the great fetish of the earth. So to draw this section together, studying this period, Fabien Locher and Jean-Baptiste Frézoz have noted the climactic paradigm, the fear that deforestation was changing the environment, a notion which clearly anticipates the definition of the Anthropocene by 2 centuries. So their argument is that there's nothing particularly new in recognizing that humans have altered their atmosphere, have altered the surface of the earth. Already in the 18th century, people were noticing this out of fears of deforestation. But what I'm arguing is that even more fundamentally, scientists, engineers, and poets were building visions of the cosmos in which human activity and intentions, with the help of romantic machines like steam engines and daguerreotypes and electromagnetic devices, were seen as unleashing demiurgic powers, shaping phenomena and concepts, ordering and framing the world, remaking the landscape as well. Socialism, communism, and other alternative political imaginaries emerged in their modern forms out of this conjuncture, which also provided fuel for the revolutions of 1848. At times, their cosmic visions reveal an extraordinary emphasis on human sovereignty and would contribute to what James Scott calls the high modernity of a later period, that which led to colonialism and imperialism. But at the same time, there was often an insistence that technological power had to be guided by attention to the limits set by our milieu, reimagined as a living being or beings that were inseparable from us, upon which we depend. The recognition of unprecedented human power of creation was also taken in the spirit of curation, a selection and presentation. But also, I want to hear earlier senses in that term, curing or cooking raw food, metabolizing, taking responsibility, administering care. Science and technology were seen as drawing forth potentials, actualizing virtualities, taking care and responsibility for humanity as well as its indissociable milieu. These are very similar to attitudes presented here in this conference as novel responses to the Anthropocene. Yet here they were already at the start of the industrial age, at the start of modernity. So why does this matter? To recover these earlier Anthropocenic views of nature or of nature culture. Why does it matter? It points to multiple trajectories within the West and industrial modernity, other than those that we see leading inevitably to today's eco-disasters and those of tomorrow, unchecked accumulation and destruction, class polarization, and constant war. This means that we have other ideals and predecessors to draw on, to rethink our relation to our milieu, even within the Western tradition, other rationalities, other ontologies, other conceptions of freedom, without having to rely on an exoticized other to reimagine ourselves. It also suggests that we shouldn't throw out the learning of 2 centuries of interpretive humanities scholarship simply because the most recent science of today has begun to raise an alarm. We should not hand over the work of explanation to fMRIs or sociobiologists because of the raw naturalist assumptions they often bring with them. On the contrary, we need interpretation and the arts of the humanities all the more to grasp the different natures that have been put forward, both outside and within the West. Indeed, we have to work against the occidentalism that assigns a uniform rationality, truth, or metaphysics to anything that calls itself science, and recognize the many different ontologies, ways of relating to the world that science can contain. Arts of interpretation, rhetoric, and translation are also needed to identify and clear the ground for working together to find the terms, the practices, the sites, and objects that can make a common world, one no longer united by uniform nature, much like Latour and Viveros de Castros have spoken about in speaking of multinaturalism. So for part 3, I'd like to put forward some thoughts about what cosmograms for today might look like. Now, I'm not going to try anything conclusive because I've already seen and heard so many fantastic examples from people who are there in the trenches working on building cosmograms for the Anthropocene. I think particularly of Jamie and Elizabeth's hyperobjects and the amazing landscapes of Nicholas Gerhalter. Sorry if I messed up that pronunciation. But that's what we're doing here already, thinking about what objects might hold the nature and culture we currently occupy. Nevertheless, from the examples I've given, we might think of some guidelines. Think about placement and access. Where a cosmogram is, how do people engage with it? Inclusion and form. What beings, what orders, and how these are linked within a cosmogram. processes of formation or assemblage, what beings are consulted, and how are their voices included, who is counted, who is not. And from Elizabeth Pavanelli's talk, I think we also should add what must be given up, what must be extinguished for a new natural and cultural order to emerge. Now, a first easy step is to see what's out there already, and the obvious way of doing this is Google search. So there's some pretty cool pictures of what the Anthropocene looks like, this kind of map of airplane routes and shipping routes where the most human activity is concentrated. This is a site called Globia, Global and Gaia together, meant to provide useful images of the Anthropocene. Bill McKibben's catchy350.org, which is setting itself as a new political movement with a very concrete goal to keep the atmosphere at a sustainable 350 parts per million of CO2, which I think is extremely admirable to make the science, right, the target of the science, part of the slogan, part of the flag that's waved. And with lots of buttons to click on to join in, to learn more and apply today for particular engagements. We saw this image a couple days ago in Will Steffen's talk, which has a distinctly 20th century or even 19th century look with metal plates hammered in and looking what looks like thermodynamic technology, a steam engine, steel plating and exhaust. Overall, it gives a fairly optimistic impression, as one might expect from The Economist. Looks like a work in progress with a mechanics that's basically under our control. That is, as long as you don't notice how much it looks like the Death Star. Now, taking a step one level up from these search results, we should also be thinking about the primary modes we now have of accessing the cosmos, which I just took for granted in calling these images up. How do we engage with the cosmos via the internet and digital interfaces, and how is that shaping our understanding of what that cosmos is? Having the whole world at our fingertips is an intoxicating cosmic figure. Simply running a search, we're provided with a taxonomy or a ranking, a map of relevance, a picture of the world. Even though looking at a crowded screen with open windows all day long, that is the embodiment of a disconnected cosmos. All in pieces, all coherence gone, to quote John Donne. To think of the cosmos we're currently making, we need to know how knowledge is produced and reaches us. The new ways in which data is collected, aggregated, and searched, as in Paul Edwards' work on data infrastructures. If Comte's cosmogram aimed at a basic scientific literacy, those of the present will also demand a much more elusive algorithmic literacy. But even now, fortunately, we still experience the cosmos sometimes in other ways than sitting at a computer. So what might we point to as three-dimensional sites, like those I discussed in the past, in which the cosmos is currently being assembled? One example of the bad Anthropocene that we've been discussing, the modern or postmodern at its most grotesque, might be the Mall of America, near Minneapolis and the Canadian border, an embodiment of the current global order, certain aspects of it, the inequality and violence of its production, cheap labor conducted under exploitative, dangerous, and environmentally unsound conditions overseas, with products brought back to feed unchecked consumerism. But just a couple weeks ago, this very building was the site for a new cosmogram, a new moment in global manifestation and the occupying of space. A very recent movement creating echoes among indigenous groups worldwide called Idle No More, launched by Native Americans to bring attention to the Canadian government's reneging on previous treaties about the use of land, and in support of Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence's demands to meet with the Prime Minister. It's been launched, and just a couple weeks ago, they occupied the Mall of America for several hours with drums and chanting. The beat of the drums echo down the halls at Mall of America as the sovereign people in the 99% show the world the sorrows we face. So merging of different movements, of different groups, taking over this space, occupying one cosmogram with another. It's a magnificent détournement to place this new wave of resistance about sovereignty, native rights, and uses of the land in this temple of unsustainable consumerism. Forcing open a gap in one cosmogram, it forges a new one on the very platform it makes possible. It's a remarkable juxtaposition between oikos as economy and oikos as ecological niche. So to bring these two senses into conversation, if not agreement, I remind you that was where we began with a quote from Michel Serres. It does seem, however, that until there's a deep revaluation of values, until we stop defining the good life in terms of sheer accumulation and growth, and begin to find some way of valuing a steady state as an optimum of health, or even the absence of needs, as I heard in the Oikos Island an hour ago. Unless that happens, there's very little chance of bringing these two senses into line. So one of the sciences we need to be engaging the most is economics, looking at the models they use, looking at the concepts that ground them, and the way in which growth, unsustainable growth, is built into their definitions of what the good society is. And until we reform those models, the kinds of much larger reforms that we're talking about, I don't think are possible. In place of the notion of growth or progress, that straight line plunging always forward and upward into the future, I'd like to add to the conversation another term, the processual form of oikos, or the performative term for oikos, oikeosis. This term was used by the Stoics for the process of making oneself at home, expanding a sense of kinship. This is inseparable from Stoic understandings of being a citizen in the universe, the cosmopolis, making your home city the cosmos as a whole. And I think we can think of it as an outward-looking aspect of ascesis, work that one does to oneself, but in relation to a wider world. This is an expanding circle, bringing the sphere of identification and empathy and sympathy to more and more beings, and arguably to more and more kinds of beings, near and far, small and big, known to us and unknown, human and non-human. In a sense, oikeosis is the complement to an antiquated definition of anthropology, the one advanced by Lévi-Strauss, who calls anthropology the technique of dépaysement, homesickness, or losing one's bearings. I think it's productive to think these two terms together, oikeosis and dépaysement, along with the friction between them. In looking for the forms to house the cosmos we're making, through choice and through unintended consequences, as well as uncontrollable cascades of events, we need to keep in mind both the leaving behind of a familiar world and at the same time approaching, if never fully having arrived in a new one, with the infinite expectation of the dawn. It's not just new narratives or new images we need, but new ways of being, new ways of experiencing and enacting the analogies between our local particular singular doing and the making that's going on at the level of the whole, how these are woven together in the very same gestures. So a couple nights ago, we spoke about animism and the turn in a lot of theory to animism as a possible way of thinking the world that is well adapted to the Anthropocene, granting a kind of agency or intention or unpredictability to the non-human. And that seems to be making a lot of inroads. But another of the possible cosmological modes that De Scola spells out, analogism, seems to me to be equally valuable and worth thinking about. Like the image of flood, like the early modern analogies between microcosm and macrocosm, we might need to think very pragmatically and very concretely of how to line up the largest scale with the smaller local and ethical scale. And develop the concept of nature, the concept of the cosmos that goes with that. Perhaps what's needed is to imagine a nature which resembles us, above all, in being perpetually other than itself. So a final scene. 1980, a major date in the neoliberal revolution when Reagan and Thatcher were elected. It was also a turning point in the cosmogram that we're now occupying. The forces being supported by this symbolic roof of Stubbins The concrete ring, over the decades, added up, became too great, disrupted the structural equilibrium of the building, and the roof collapsed, killing one journalist inside. 1980, yeah. So, 32 years ago. This is true, yeah, and sad. And I hate to end on a down note in that way, but given the overall situation of the Anthropocene, I think that's hard to avoid. And at least in this case, we're sitting in the proof that this smaller story, at least, has a happy ending. So as a final image, I find the following one striking and apt. In some ways, we're like the man in the back, documenting the latest catastrophe. But we're also like the man in the foreground, puzzled, concerned, but somehow resolute, ready to think. And I'm not sure who this person is. If you're here, please make yourself known to me. And if you know who it is, let me know. But I just like that expression as what we're facing, aptly facing the situation we're in. Here in the gap between the plan and the reality, between leaving home and making a new one. That's the Anthropocene, that's where we're living. And knowing that this is our condition, this is our oikos, and it's also our oyster, we can think about with what materials, with what rhythms and frictions we rebuild the house of the world, not just its cultures, but the world itself. Thank you.